Okay, so we are moving on with our State Board of Nursing discussion. What would a Model Nurse Practice Act do? Since that's most of the state board's job. It defines the scope of nursing practice in detail. Which procedures are delegated to unlicensed assistive personnel, which can be performed by licensed professional nurses, which can be performed under the scope of a registered nurse, and which ones have to be advanced practice. So, prescribing medications or ordering medications is not a function of an RN. It's the function of maybe an advanced practice nurse in your state. Sometimes yes, and sometimes no. That all gets defined in the Nursing Practice Act. LPNs in New Jersey cannot assess patients. They cannot administer medications, IV push. All of that is spelled out in detail. It's not in the original law, it is in the Nurse Practice Act. A Model Nurse Practice Act would allow nurses to practice to the full extent of their training and skills, and that is a big push by the American Nurses Association. It should clearly define educational requirements for becoming a licensed practical nurse, a registered nurse, or a advanced practice nurse, and for certification. It establishes standards of practice, protects the public from unsafe practice, and promotes accountability by requiring continuing education, by requiring renewal, and by disciplining nurses who violate the Nurse Practice Act in some way. What authority do they have? Well, as I said, they regulate the education of nurses. They go over a curriculum in great detail and decide whether it includes all of the necessary elements for generalist or specialist nurse practice. They participate through the National Council of State Boards of Nursing in the development of NCLEX. They govern the process of licensure. So there are people employed by the State Board of Nursing who will review applications, grant authority to test, and then issue the license once an NCLEX has been passed. They investigate complaints of unsafe practice through a formal investigation process. They can administer discipline as needed to protect the public, and they decide on scope for LPNs, RNs, advanced practice nurse, and unlicensed assistive personnel so that you know what you can and cannot delegate to those folks. Who serves on the Pennsylvania State Board? Well, I started talking about it. All of them are political appointees. They're appointed by the governor. 3 members from the community at large, 6 registered nurses, at least 3 with a master's degree, 2 practical nurses, 1 registered dietitian, and each of them serves for 6 years at the most. And if they have to serve less time, for example, for illness, or they decide to step down, they can be replaced by the governor. What do you need to be licensed? Well, that varies by state, but generally, you have to graduate from an accredited school of nursing. It has to be approved by the state board, and often it has to be accredited by either ASEN, which is the accreditation for colleges of education and nursing. They can accredit community college, diploma schools, and baccalaureate, or CCNE, which is the Commission for Credentialing of Nursing Education, and they only do baccalaureate and beyond. But you have to graduate from a school of nursing that was given privilege to open and accept students. Then you're going to need to pass the NCLEX. If you want to be a licensed practical nurse, you have to pass the NCLEX PN. And if you want to be a registered nurse, you pass the NCLEX RN. In most cases, you have to have a background check that shows that you are free from serious crimes and misdemeanors. They call it crimes of moral turpitude. Exceptions can be granted on a case-by-case basis, depending on the nature of the crime, length of time since it was committed, evidence of rehabilitation, and character witnesses, but I am going to caution you, it is a lengthy process. I had a student once who had a DUI 15 years prior. He had not had one since. Then, as far as I know, didn't even drink. And he had to apply for a pardon from the governor of Pennsylvania to be allowed to take the NCLEX. And they put him through that. It was, I want to say, almost 2 years before they gave him authority to test. So that is something that you should be aware of. Other aspects of licensure. There is licensure by endorsement. Let's say you get your license in Pennsylvania and the perfect job opens up in Delaware. If you hold the license in one state, you can apply for a license in another without having to retake the test or anything else. There's compact licensure. This one gets tricky legally. It allows nurses to practice in multiple states, and this is important for things like telehealth or nurses who live on borders of states, and maybe they have a job in one. Like I work in New Jersey, but I also work in Pennsylvania, so I need 2 licenses. Pennsylvania does not offer compact licensure yet. New Jersey, I think, does, but I have to hold 2 licenses. Compact licensure helps you get around that obstacle and allows you to practice in multiple states. However, you can just move to a state on your old license because they're both compact states. If you move from, let's say, New Jersey to Texas or Florida, and they're both in the compact licensure agreement, you still have to apply for licensure in your home state, wherever your permanent address is. And nurses have been disciplined for not doing that. Other aspects, licensure renewal is usually annually or biannually. They're supposed to send you a renewal statement, and then you apply for it. And you need to show that you've had your continuing education. In Pennsylvania, New Jersey, we also have to do mandated reporter training for child abuse. If you have advanced practice licensure, you have to graduate from an accredited advanced practice program, and then you pass a rigorous certification exam. Then you reapply to the state board, and you have to maintain your currency to practice. Not only do you have to have stronger continuing education at the APN level, you also have to have a certain number of hours in many states of practice. So some people go and they get their nurse practitioner certification, and then they want to work as nurse faculty or something else. If they're not putting in, I believe Pennsylvania is 1,000 hours a year, they can't renew their advanced practice license. Those are just some things you should know. Formal disciplinary actions. How can your license be investigated or reprimanded or revoked? It begins with a formal complaint. And that complaint can come from a patient, family, employer, or colleague. In some cases, the person kind of turns themselves into the nursing board. For example, if your license expires and you weren't aware and you practiced on it. But it begins with a formal complaint. The board reviews the complaint, and if the allegation is covered by the Nurse Practice Act, they will investigate it. The defendant can then request a hearing. They can appeal a ruling. It's very difficult sometimes to do so. If you're ever in that position, I recommend A, you have malpractice insurance to pay a lawyer, and B, you hire a nurse attorney who has successfully defended other clients. There's no statute of limitations. It doesn't matter how long it's been, and only a very few states will expunge discipline. So it's not like it's on your record for 10 years and then it goes away. Never goes away. And it's reported usually to NurseSys, which is a central database. Some of the more common complaints, practice related, either unsafe behaviors, failure to assess, failure to rescue, failure to communicate findings to a provider, giving the wrong medication, failure to document care that you gave, or documenting something fraudulently. Drug related, that's maybe the most common category, where a nurse is found unfit to practice because of impairment under the influence of alcohol or addictive drugs. Boundary related, this is a big one. And I know a lot of nurses get themselves in trouble with this, and they don't get reported to the board, but they could. Social media can be really tricky. Maybe you're taking care of a patient or family over a very long period of time. It happens in things like hospice. It happens in NICU. It happens in other settings, where you develop not only a therapeutic relationship, but a personal one. And that personal relationship is problematic to begin with. But then when you're posting photos, or maybe you're commenting, even being friends with somebody on social media and commenting on a post that they write, and disclosing maybe some of their care details. You think you're being a friend, but really you're violating HIPAA. So boundary related causes can also be investigated. Sexual misconduct is maybe the least common complaint, but it does happen. And then there are other things, administrative things, expired license, being outside your scope, things like that. Drug related, most common. Remember that for the rat. Okay. So what can formal disciplinary actions look like? They can look like fines and fees. Sometimes you pay a fee and that's it. It could be a public reprimand with no restriction. It doesn't keep you from practicing, but anyone can see it. It's a matter of public record. Restrictions on practice. For example, you can't work in a place that has narcotics, or you can't work night shift, or you can't work in home care. Remediation with educational modules. So maybe a client who failed to recognize a cue, and the patient um, had a bad outcome, might need to go back for health assessment. A patient or a nurse who didn't document something appropriately or documented something fraudulently might have to go back for a documentation class. There's probation, where they suspend your license, or where you have a license to work, but it can be taken at any time. There's suspension, which can be temporary, where you are not allowed to practice for 6 months or 8 months. And then there's permanent revocation, in which a nurse's privilege to practice is revoked permanently. For drug-related cases, sometimes there's an alternative to disciplinary program. I think the one in New Jersey is called RAMP, and it involves recovery, agreement to drug screens, and sometimes other restrictions. NurseSys is the reporting system. It's a big database where anybody can basically see. All right, we're going to stop there and pick up with some of the more common types of malpractice and negligence.